so we're just going to talk a little bit about the new commission that we've done for the Royal Ontario Museum. It's called Sikhs in Canada, and it basically looks at the history of the Sikhs in Canada over the past 100 or so years. There's a very strong narrative to this, kind of a timeline of where the Sikhs came from and how they've contributed to Canadian society in various ways. Looking at the top part of the picture here, you've got imagery that really looks at the pattern of migration of Sikhs. So this little detail here is the Gurdwara in Hong Kong, which is one of the port of calls that many of the Sikhs coming from India actually visited, and they were quite instrumental in helping those Sikhs, setting them on their feet and getting all their paperwork in order, ready for the trip over to Canada. A lot of them travelled by the Pacific liner, Canadian Pacific liner here, which is represented in the painting. And of course they settled across the whole scope of Canada, from the east coast to the west coast. So that's represented here by the CN Tower, obviously for the east, and this landscape here, which is British Columbia. We've also represented the various modes of occupation that many of the first migrants to Canada took on, and they were very much within the industries of the railways and the lumber industries, pretty much those occupations that helped to build the infrastructure of Canada.
But they weren't labourers back in India, a lot of them. So some of the lumber workers here, when you can kind of look quite close in, they're wearing stethoscopes and they've got doctor's bags next to them. So it was the idea that, you know, a lot of these Sikhs that came ended up working as labourers, but they were actually trained professionals in their country of origin.
And then a key focus of the painting is this section here, which is the Nagar Kirtan, or religious procession, that obviously we're all familiar with in many of the cities around the world where Sikhs celebrate Vaisakhi very openly and visibly, celebrating their distinct identity. And many of the figures in this procession are actual people who came to Canada, particularly the section here at the back, which is done in black and white. And that really copies some of the very early archival images of the very first pioneers to settle in Canada. Some of the figures, for example, these two Sikh gentlemen here were musicians that came, and they were quite instrumental in the means in which some of the early settlers were able to maintain some of their religious traditions through the religious hymns, the kirtan. You've got other figures like this Sikh gentleman here who's dressed in a pilot's uniform, who was one of Canada's first pilots. He then went to US and sort of took up a degree in aeronautical engineering. And this Sikh gentleman here who's wearing an Indian hockey t-shirt, and very often the first pioneers, one of the ways in which they'd integrate into the community, the wider community, was through sports activities and sports clubs. You've also got key figures such as the Sikh Olympic representative and the first Sikh to wear a turban in the police force in British Columbia. And the whole idea, this concept of the procession, if you like, of a movement from point A to B, is also very symbolic of a kind
history
of movement
timeline.
in history, the timeline of where the Sikhs started and where they've come today in Canadian society.
Yeah, so in a sense it's an unfinished story, because the procession is moving beyond the borders of the main narrative, and it's moving out of there. So it's a continuing, ongoing story of the Sikhs that have yet to be told. And you've got references to when the women were allowed into Canada, because at first, of course, the men were not allowed to bring their wives, and it was the women really that brought with them the kind of institutions of family life and the other Sikh heritages. But they also had to make compromises. So although they're wearing Western dress, one of the ladies is wearing a traditional Fulkari shawl, obviously associated with wedding and therefore family and marriage and all those important institutions that went with Sikh life.
There's also represented some of the struggles that the early settlers, and still today I guess, the Sikh community are having to face. So you have the Rex Cinema here, which there was a little story that we were reading, because a lot of the research we did for this painting was online, and we uncovered all sorts of stories about the experience of the early settlers. And this little story was about how the mainstream population had complained about Sikhs wearing turbans in the cinema. And they had a little bit of a battle on their hands, but I think the Sikhs overcame it by saying that the women in the cinema with the large hats, well, the main complaint was that the turbans obscured the view of the film, which may have been a bit of a smokescreen, but anyway, the argument then came back that the women in the cinema in those days, we're talking about the early 1900s, were also obscuring the view, so they won a sort of minor victory there. But you also have Baltej Singh here as a Royal Canadian Monty, who I'm sure most Canadian Sikhs in particular will know about the struggle to get the turban recognised within the Royal Canadian Mountie tradition, and how difficult that was.
And then there's obvious events in Sikh history that we couldn't leave out that seem to be landmarks. So the Kamagathamaru event is represented in this mosaic here, which was a public artwork, which was it was done for a mainstream public arts event. So it was, in a way, we chose that because it showed how something that was quite specific to the Sikh community had been recognised within a mainstream Canadian history in that way.
But the Kamagathamaru event was something that again challenged the racist immigration laws of Canada back in the 1900s. And the person that was instrumental in that whole affair is represented in the painting by Gurjit Singh here. There's also features in the painting that look at how the Sikhs have received official recognition and appreciation. So you have the parliamentary buildings of Ottawa here, which represent Sikhs in Parliament and administration. You have the stamp here, commemorative stamp, which was officially brought out to recognise the 300th anniversary of the Khalsa, which again was an important celebration and marking of distinct Sikh identity. And the text here, the Spirit-Born People exhibition, which was actually held at the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, which was about recognising the contribution of Sikhs in the World Wars 1 and 2 in particular. Yeah. And then the creative aspect of the community is also represented. So you have the Royal Ontario Museum represented quite centrally in the painting, not only because they were the ones that have commissioned this particular work, but also because they have promoted Sikh cultural artistic identity in various ways in the past too. For example, through the Spinning Wheel Film Festival, which was initially screened at ROM, and also the Arts of the Sikh Kingdom exhibition, again, which was a major exhibition that toured from UK, which really highlighted the rich cultural and artistic heritage of the community.
But it was important to get the artistic representation in there, because I think, again, it's an indication of how far the Sikh community have come. I think it's only once a community is well established and affluent that it can then turn its attentions to the luxury of being involved in the arts, really. And so that was an indication of the success story, if you like, that the Sikh community has achieved.
And then you have the preservation of Sikh faith. So we've got the Gurdwara at Vancouver here, which was one of the first to have been built, again taken from an archive photograph, and the arrival of the very first Guru Granth Sahib into Canada in, I think, around 1904, which was organised by the Khalsa Diwan Society, which was a society that was set up to really support the incoming communities into Canada very early on.
Yeah, but also there's the links that many of the early Sikhs had with their homeland in India, which is represented again with the Gurdwara here, with the Indian flag and the Independence India signs, and celebrating freedom of India, because Sikhs over here were instrumental in supporting the independence movement back home. It was an important connection for the early years. And there's also lots of little hidden symbols within the work too. So, for example, the carpet, decorative carpet in the background. We always like to get some decoration in our work. It's part of the kind of character of our work, if you like, but it's always nice to have something that's also significant in that respect. So we were thinking of ways of how the decoration on the carpet could be also significant to the whole narrative. And what we decided to do was use the various crops that a lot of the Sikh farmers were well known for, like the cranberries and the strawberries, have those represented on the carpet by incorporating them into the design. So that's where that comes from. There's other things like the kind of the seas are very the kind of turmoil of the sea and the clouds. It represented the hardship of the early pioneers.
And then things like this little detail here, this decorative detail, which is a paisley pattern, which of course is associated with Punjab, and within that you have the Canadian maple leaf. So that was a symbol of the kind of togetherness of the two communities, but also the way in which the Sikhs are very proud to feel Canadian whilst maintaining their identity. In fact, the whole painting really is about a community that has succeeded against the odds and really contributed to Canadian society without losing sight of their traditional heritage. And we hope it gives a general representation, a very positive representation of our communities in Canada.